Let's say hello now on Outside the Lines to Dean Garnett, an MMA fighter based in Liverpool, England, coming to us today from Manchester. He recently, Dean had to lose 15 pounds in 24 hours. And Brett Okamoto covers the UFC for ESPN.com. He tweeted concisely 2 months ago, quote, "Someday we'll look back on severe weight cutting and wonder, WTF was that all about?" And Brett, that seems like a natural point to begin. WTF is it all about right now?
Yeah, it's just an ingrained thing in the culture, and eventually I do think it will go away. It'll be like, you know, when we look back on old hockey footage and they weren't wearing face masks, the goalies weren't, or, you know, the football players were wearing leather helmets. We'll look back and say, why did these guys, who were the same size, the same weight, both deplete themselves a day before the fight, and then just rehydrate themselves so that they could be the same size once again once they stepped into the octagon? That just makes absolutely no sense. Someday I do think it will be done and over with, but I think it's going to take a little bit of time before we see that.
Since you covered this sport, how much in recent years has the velocity and the conversation on this picked up recently?
I think it's picked up a lot, and it's picked up in the places that it needed to. It picked up in the athletic commissions. You know, California is really leading the way. Nevada is doing a study on this as well. They're really in tune to it, and they're paying attention to it. It just takes time to address it, to say, what are we going to do in our statutes to address this problem? And I think the promotions are looking at it as well. You know, one championship over in the Middle East, they've just raised all of their weight classes, really. What we used to think of as welterweight, they now call middleweight. They just changed their weight classes so these guys wouldn't be cutting as much weight anymore. The UFC is introducing that 8% rule, saying these guys have to come in within 8% of their fight weight. So these are steps in the right direction, but again, I think it's just going to take a long time before we see extreme weight cutting done and over with.
All right, Dean, I'm going to address this question to you. I know we're dealing with a bit of a delay between the states and Manchester, but how much danger have you ever felt that, looking back, you may have placed yourself in some of the severe weight cutting you've engaged in?
I think it's certainly the most dangerous behaviour that MMA as a whole will drag you into. As a fighter, I've been in some bad situations myself, but more so as a coach as well. I've been in situations where people have been severely dehydrated during weight cuts, and we've got to ask the question, if an athlete dies cutting weight, then is the team or the coaching staff with that athlete, are they responsible in any way? Because, you know, this is a question that we've got to ask.
What's the worst position you've ever felt yourself being in this regard?
Well, I mean, when it's myself cutting weight, I always feel confident that I'm going to get the job done. It's more so as a coach that the most difficult position is looking at fighters who potentially are close to death almost, but yet they're determined to continue cutting weight, and obviously they want the fight to go ahead. So for me, that's the most difficult position, is watching others in this situation when they're clearly struggling.
What's the most drastic thing, Dean, you've ever done to severely cut weight in advance of a fight?
Well, there's not one particular thing. It's the overall process is absolutely grueling, and every time I do it to the bantamweight 135-pound class, it's always going to be 14, 15, 16, 17 pounds in 10 hours. That's just how much weight I have to cut to get down there. But at featherweight, I feel like some of the guys that I could compete against in that division, they're going to come in maybe 10, 12 pounds heavier than me with a bigger reach. So for me, it's important to be competitive as possible, and if cutting weight's what I've got to do to make it to the top of the game, then that's what I'm prepared to do.
If cutting weight is such an ordeal for you physically, and we hear this story from a number of different mixed martial arts fighters, what does that do to your effectiveness as a fighter? How well do you fight if you put yourself through hell?
Well, if you look at my record in particular, I have a lot of first round and early finishes. So early on in the fight, then that size advantage, it can be enough to end the bout early. So for me, it's been largely effective. However, there have been 1 or 2 occasions in my career where in the 3rd round, when I have gone into a 3-round fight, I've felt particularly tired in the last round, and I do attribute that to the weight cut itself. One time I still managed to achieve the win, and another time I end up getting a draw as a result of receiving a 10-8 in the round. But you know, it's all small margins in elite sport, and yeah, you know, we're all looking to get any advantage we can get.
Brett, what are your observations on how fighters fare after severe cutting and how it may impact the quality of the competition we're seeing?
Well, of course, you know, guys who don't have as drastic of weight cuts, they tend to do a little bit better. You know, I've heard of guys who literally have lost feeling in their feet, you know, and they can't seem to get their legs under them. You know, some guys, although we really don't have the scientific studies to prove this, say that their chin isn't the same. They can't take a punch quite as well if they've had a terrible weight cut. So a lot of this is mental. You know, fighting is such a mental, individual sport anyway, and so then when you add the fact that if a guy has had a very drastic weight cut, that can mess with you in 24 hours ahead of your fight. So really different guys take to it differently, but of course a bad weight cut can absolutely affect your performance, and there have been countless examples of this.
Brett, what's the worst you've seen or heard about?
Yeah, I would say, you know, guys who do lose their feeling in their legs and they feel like they can't get their legs under them. You know, obviously anytime a guy goes to the hospital, you know, the UFC just lost a huge fight earlier this month. Khabib Nurmagomedov was supposed to fight Tony Ferguson in the co-main event of a pay-per-view card. It was supposed to be for an interim title. His liver started to shut down during his weight cut. His blood pressure dropped. He had to be hospitalized. These are stories that that you hear. You hear from time to time. It seems like every month a fight falls apart just because, you know, someone just didn't quite have their weight cut under control and was forced to go to the hospital because of it.
Dean Garnett, Brett Okamoto. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today Outside the Lines. Thanks.